Jax's revenge domain.
The new operations director thought he could run $1 billion naval contract with a spreadsheet and a college degree. He humiliated me in front of my crew, screaming that I was a dinosaur because I prioritized safety over his delivery schedule. He didn't realize that without my stamp of approval, no ship leaves this yard, so I pulled my certification from his $1.20 billion destroyer project, and the chaos that followed cost him everything. I'm Wade Foster, 55 years old, and I've been building ships since Carter was president. Started here as an 18-year-old apprentice welder, worked my way up through every department. Now I'm chief engineer with 37 years of steel dust in my lungs and salt water in my veins. The coffee in the engineering office always tasted like motor oil and metal shavings. But after nearly 4 decades in this business, I didn't drink it for the flavor. I drank it to stay alert when lives were on the line. It was 5:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the fog was rolling in from the bay, wrapping around the massive hull of the USS Hamilton like a gray blanket. Through the fabrication shop windows, I could see the sparks flying from Tommy Wells' welding torch. The kid was good minus steady hands, precise work. He reminded me of myself when I started here, eager to prove I belonged. The sound of expensive dress shoes clicking on the concrete floor cut through the morning quiet like fingernails on a calcboard. I knew that sound well by now. It wasn't the steel minus stowed boots of a welder or the rubber soles of a crane operator. It was the sharp tap minus stap of someone who'd never walked a deck plate in his life, never felt the heat of a cutting torch, never understood that building warships isn't about spreadsheets and efficiency metrics. Foster, the voice called out, cutting through the industrial hum. It was nasal, impatient, and carried the tone of someone used to having people jump when he spoke. I turned around slowly, setting down my inspection checklist. The morning light was just starting to filter through the high windows, casting long shadows across the work floor. "Morning, Coleman. You're up early." Brent Coleman stood there looking like he'd stepped out of a business magazine minus one of those articles about young executives reshaping American industry. Navy suit pressed to perfection, red power tie, Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than most of my welders made in a week. He was third eye for, fresh out of some fancy business school, and he'd been running operations for exactly 3 weeks and 2 days. I'd been counting. In those 3 weeks, he hadn't asked a single question about metallurgy or structural stress. He hadn't inquired about welding certifications or hull integrity standards. He only asked about schedules, cost overruns, and what he called productivity metrics. It was like watching someone try to conduct a symphony orchestra using a calculator. "I don't sleep when there's inefficiency to correct," Coleman said, walking over to the steel frame drawings spread across my work table. He glanced at them like they were written in ancient hieroglyphics. "I've been reviewing the progress reports, Foster. The Hamilton is 12 days behind schedule. The Navy liaison is breathing down our necks." I looked at him, keeping my face neutral. After 37 years of dealing with management types, I'd learned that showing emotion early in these conversations usually made things worse. "We found stress fractures in the main engine mounts yesterday. Had to cut out the bad welds and start over. We prioritize structural integrity here, not speed." Coleman turned to me, his eyes narrowing like he was trying to focus on something very small and irritating. "Structural integrity is a luxury we can't afford right now. This contract is worth $1 billion to this company. If we miss the delivery date, we forfeit $50 million in penalty clauses. That's 800 jobs, Foster. 800 families counting on us to deliver. If we deliver a ship with bad welds, we forfeit a lot more than money," I replied, gesturing toward the massive hull visible through the shop windows. "These destroyers defend America. Sailors' lives depend on every rivet, every weld, every bolt. I won't sign off on substandard work." Coleman checked his Rolex minus, the kind that costs more than a new pickup truck. "The Navy inspector arrives next week for final certification. I want this ship ready for sea trials. No delays, no excuses, no more of your old minus school perfectionism. Do I make myself clear?" I looked back at the welding specifications spread across my desk. Numbers don't lie. and physics doesn't negotiate. Hull welds need 48 hours minimum curing time. The stress analysis shows potential failure points at 75% of normal operating load. It's not negotiable, Coleman. Everything's negotiable. Foster, he snapped, his voice rising an octave. This isn't 1985. We don't have the luxury of taking our sweet time anymore. Competition is fierce. The Chinese are building destroyers in half the time we are. The Chinese are building them to last. I said quietly. Our ships need to operate for 30 years in combat conditions. That requires precision, not speed. Holman's face was starting to turn that particular shade of red I'd seen before in executives who were realizing their business school theories weren't working in the real world. Make it happen, Foster. Find a way to accelerate the process, or I'll find someone who can. The threat hung in the air between us like smoke from a bad weld. I'd heard variations of it before from other bosses over the years, but something about Coleman's tone was different. More desperate. More dangerous. I'll review the specs again, I said finally, but I won't compromise safety. Good, Coleman said, straightening his tie. I knew you'd see reason. But as he walked away, clicking across the concrete in those expensive shoes, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By 7 a.m. The morning shift was in full swing. The shipyard hummed with the familiar symphony of American manufacturing minus cranes groaning under massive loads, cutting torches hissing through steel plate, pneumatic hammers chattering against rivets. I sat at my desk reviewing the metallurgical reports when Linda Rodriguez rolled her chair over from the environmental compliance station. She was a woman in her early 52s who'd been fighting corporate corner minus cutting for as long as I'd been welding steel, and she had that look on her face that meant trouble. You see the latest water samples from the paint shop? She asked, sliding a manila folder across my desk with the kind of careful deliberation that told me I wasn't going to like what was inside. I opened it and felt my stomach tighten like a bad weld under stress. The numbers weren't just bad minus, they were catastrophic. Heavy metals, volatile organic compounds, benzene derivatives minus, all way above EPA limits. Some readings were 10 times the legal threshold. Jesus. Linda, how long has it been like this? 6 months, she said quietly, glancing toward the administrative offices where Coleman held court. I've been sending reports to his office every week. He keeps saying he's optimizing the treatment schedule, and that environmental compliance is a legacy cost center that needs restructuring. I tapped the lab results with my finger. The paper felt thin and fragile, but the implications were anything but. This isn't optimization. This is dumping. If EPA finds out about this, we're looking at $25 million in fines minimum. Maybe criminal charges. I told Coleman exactly that 3 weeks ago, Linda whispered, her voice barely audible over the industrial noise filtering through the windows. He said the reports were alarmist and that environmental compliance was hurting productivity. He actually used the phrase regulatory theater. My phone buzzed with a text message. Coleman again. Engineering office. Now. Urgent. I stood up, grabbing my hard hat from the hook beside my desk. Keep documenting everything, Linda. Every sample, every report, every conversation. This is going to get ugly before it gets better. The walk to the administrative building felt longer than usual, like walking through knee-minus deep mud. Through the windows of Coleman's corner office, I could see him pacing behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly with his free hand. When I knocked, he didn't look up, just waved me in with an impatient gesture. The Navy liaison just called, Coleman said, hanging up and turning to face me. His tie was slightly loosened, and there was a thin sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Captain Roy Hutchins wants a comprehensive status update on the Hamilton. I told him everything's on schedule for next week's inspection. That's not accurate, I said, keeping my voice level. We need another week minimum for proper curing time on those engine mounts. Probably 2 weeks if we want to do this right. Coleman slammed his hand on the desk hard enough to make his coffee mug jump. Dark liquid sloshed onto a stack of production reports. I don't care about your conservative estimates. Foster. I care about delivery dates and penalty clauses. The hull integrity is fine. The engine mounts will hold. You're being paranoid. Paranoid. I stepped closer to his desk, and for the first time since this conversation started, I let some of my real feelings show. Coleman, I've been building warships since before you were born. These stress fractures aren't theoretical problems in a textbook. They're physics. They're reality. They're the difference between a ship that comes home and one that breaks apart in heavy seas. Physics, Coleman laughed, but it was a bitter sound with no humor in it. You know what's physics? Money. Profit margins. Shareholder value. Market forces. This company doesn't need another old minus school perfectionist lecturing about theoretical problems. It needs efficiency and results. He walked around his desk, getting close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne minus, something European and sharp that probably cost more per ounce than I made per hour. Let me explain something to you, Foster. You make $98 a year to stamp papers and tell welders what to do. I make decisions that affect 800 families, for $billion in future contracts, and the strategic defense capabilities of the United States Navy. Those 800 families deserve safe ships and clean water, I said, my voice dropping to the low, careful tone I used when explaining something to apprentices who weren't getting it. Not cover-ups and shortcuts and environmental crimes. That was the spark that lit the fuse. Coleman exploded like a faulty boiler. Don't lecture me about families. I'm trying to save jobs here while you're nitpicking weld patterns and crying about paint fumes. You union guys are all the same minus hide behind safety regulations when you're really just afraid of working hard. He grabbed the metallurgy report off his desk and waved it at me like it was evidence in a courtroom. This is bureaucratic garbage. Stress tolerances, fatigue analysis, environmental impact studies. We're building a destroyer, not a luxury yacht. It doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to float, fight, and get delivered on time. It needs to not break apart when sailors' lives depend on it. I corrected him, but Coleman was beyond listening now. You think you're untouchable because you've got 37 years seniority. Because the union protects you. Because you're some kind of irreplaceable expert. His voice was rising to a near-minus shout now, and I was pretty sure people in the outer offices could hear every word. Let me tell you something, Foster. You're just a glorified mechanic with an attitude problem. I run this facility. I make the decisions. I determine who stays and who goes. He leaned in close enough that I could see the small drops of sweat beading on his upper lip despite the cool morning air. If you don't sign off on those engine mounts by end of shift today, Foster minus, I'll fire you for insubordination. I'll make sure you never work in shipbuilding again. Your pension, your benefits, your reputation, your legacy minus all of it gone. Do you understand me? I looked at him, really looked at him. At the desperation behind the arrogance. At the fear of a man who'd promised his superiors something he was beginning to realize he couldn't deliver. At the sweat, the flushed face, the trembling hands of someone whose carefully constructed world was starting to crumble. Is that your final decision, Coleman? I asked quietly. It is, he said, straightening his jacket and trying to regain some composure. Sign the papers or pack your tools. All right, I said, reaching into my shirt pocket. You want my signature? I pulled out my chief engineer's certification card minus a laminated piece of plastic that looked ordinary enough but represented 25 years of training, testing, and experience. It was the card that gave me legal authority to approve structural work on naval vessels. Without it, the Navy wouldn't accept delivery of any ship from this yard. Insurance companies wouldn't cover the liability. The Coast Guard wouldn't issue sailing permits. I placed it on Coleman's desk with a solid thunk that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet office. What is this supposed to be? Coleman asked, his voice uncertain for the first time since I'd known him. You just fired the only person in this facility authorized to certify destroyer construction, I said, taking a step back toward the door. As of right now, 9:15. I'm relieving myself of all duties. I'm no longer an employee of Atlantic Shipbuilding Corporation. Coleman's eyes went wide as the implications started to sink in. Stop the drama, Foster. Just sign the papers and get back to work. I can't, I said, moving toward the door. Federal regulations prohibit civilians from certifying naval construction. Maritime law, insurance liability minus, bureaucracy. The kind of red tape you're always complaining about. I turned to his secretary, who'd been pretending not to listen through the thin office walls. Carol, please log it. Chief Engineer Wade Foster, off duty as of 9:15. Terminated by Operations Director Coleman for refusing to violate federal safety standards. Foster, wait, Coleman called, but I was already walking out into the morning air. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove my F-250 up to Murphy's Tavern, the bar where shipyard workers had been gathering for 3 generations. It was early for drinking, but Murphy always had coffee on for the night shift guys getting off work. The place smelled like cigarettes, bacon grease, and honest sweat minus a lot more honest than Coleman's cologne. I ordered black coffee and called Helen Martinez, the attorney who'd handled our union contracts for the past 15 years. She picked up on the second ring. Wade. Her voice was crisp but warm. Don't tell me you're calling from jail. Better, I said, watching the morning news through the bar's dusty television. I just got fired for refusing to sign off on unsafe work. Who fired you? The new operations director, Brent Coleman. Harvard MBA type. Thinks destroyers are just floating office buildings. What did he want you to approve? Engine mounts with stress fractures, rush delivery schedule, and hell and minus there's something else. Environmental violations. 6 months of illegal dumping to cut costs. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Helen spoke again, her voice had shifted into what I called her legal shark mode. Wade, if he's covering up environmental crimes to meet contract deadlines, that's not just negligence. That's federal felony territory. Keep your phone on. I need to make some calls. While I was sitting in Murphy's, watching coverage of some political scandal on the news, Coleman was having what would turn out to be the worst morning of his corporate career. The Navy inspector, Captain Roy Hutchins, had arrived early for his preliminary assessment. Roy was an old friend minus. We'd served together on the USS Midway back in the early 82nds, when we were both young sailors who thought we knew everything. Roy had stayed Navy. I'd come home to build ships. But we both understood quality when we saw it. According to Tommy Wells, who was texting me updates from the shop floor, Roy had taken one look at the Hamilton's engine mounts and started asking questions that Coleman couldn't answer. Where's Chief Engineer Foster? Roy had asked, reviewing his inspection checklist. I need his certification before we proceed with any testing. Foster is temporarily unavailable. Coleman had stammered, loosening his tie. We have other qualified personnel reviewing the work. Roy had pulled out his tablet and scrolled through the Navy's contractor database. I show Foster as the primary certifying engineer for this contract. Where's his deputy certification? We're in a transition period with our engineering staff. Transition to who? Roy had pressed, and this was where Coleman's morning had really started to fall apart. Captain, this is a $1.20 billion destroyer with advanced weapons systems. I need a chief engineer's signature on every major structural component. Coleman had tried calling the regional office, desperate to find anyone with the right clearances and certifications. But here's something they don't teach you in business school minus. Naval engineering certification takes decades to earn, and there are maybe 50 people in the entire country qualified to do what I do. None of them worked for Atlantic Shipbuilding, and none of them were available to bail out a panicked operations director who just fired his chief engineer over a safety dispute. By 11 o'clock, word was spreading through the shipyard faster than sparks from a cutting torch. The welders knew. The crane operators knew. The guys in the paint shop knew. Even the security guards at the front gate knew. Without my certification, the Hamilton wasn't going anywhere, and neither were the next 3 destroyers in the production pipeline. Tommy called me around noon. Wade, man, they're bringing in corporate executives from Norfolk. 3 black sedans just pulled up to the admin building. Coleman looks like he's about to throw up. How's the crew holding up? I asked, genuinely concerned. These were my guys minus men I'd trained, worked alongside, shared coffee and complaints with 4 years. Solidarity. Brother, nobody's crossing any lines here. Word is, if they can fire you for doing your job right, none of us are safe. Mike Martinez called an emergency union meeting for tonight. Mike Martinez was our union president, a former welder who'd worked his way up to represent 800 Atlantic shipbuilding workers. He was tough, smart, and had no patience for corporate games. If Mike was calling an emergency meeting, it meant the union was preparing for war. Tell Mike I'll be there, I said. He figured you would be. Wait, there's something else. Linda Rodriguez has been copying files all morning. Environmental reports, water samples, emails. She's building a case. That's when I knew this was bigger than just my job. It was about every welder who took pride in his work, every crane operator who moved steel with precision, every painter who understood that cutting corners on a warship meant putting sailors at risk. It was about the difference between building something that lasted and building something that looked good on a quarterly report. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Foster, please call immediately. We need to discuss this situation. Minus BC Brett Coleman begging. I showed the message to Murphy, who was wiping down glasses behind the bar. You gonna call him back? Murphy asked. Not yet, I said. Let him sweat a little. Maybe he'll learn something. Around 2 o'clock. p.m. Helen called back. Wait, I just spoke with EPA Criminal Investigations Division. They're very interested in those water samples Linda Rodriguez has been documenting. I also reached out to the Navy Inspector General's office. Apparently, someone already flagged Coleman's interference with safety inspections. Someone? Captain Hutchins. He's been documenting everything since he arrived this morning. Every conversation, every refusal to provide proper certification, every attempt to pressure him into accepting substandard work. My phone started buzzing with calls from unknown numbers. Word was getting out that Atlantic Shipbuilding had a major problem, and the Maritime Industry Gossip Network was faster than the internet. I let them all go to voicemail. Around 3:30. The afternoon news vans started arriving at the shipyard gates. Someone had leaked the story that a major defense contractor was having certification issues with a Navy destroyer. The stock price for Atlantic Shipbuilding Corporation dropped 12% in the first hour of trading. By market close, it was down 18%. Coleman was making desperate calls to anyone who might have the certification to replace me. But Mike Martinez, our union president, had put out the word to every marine engineer on the East Coast. Atlantic Shipbuilding had fired their chief engineer for refusing to violate safety standards. Until this was resolved properly, the Brotherhood was watching. 4:45 p.m. my phone rang. Helen's number. Wade, you need to see the news. Turn on channel 7th. I asked Murphy to change the channel. The reporter was standing outside the shipyard gates, and behind her I could see federal vehicles minus, not just EPA inspectors, but FBI sedans with government plates. Sources confirm that federal agents have arrived at Atlantic Shipbuilding Corporation to investigate allegations of environmental crimes and interference with military contract safety inspections. The company's stock has plummeted as questions mount about a $1.20 billion destroyer project that appears to be stalled over certification disputes. They moved fast. I told Helen, environmental crimes involving defense contracts get priority treatment. Wait, there's something else. They found a pattern of falsified reports going back 3 years. This isn't just about cutting corners. It's systematic fraud. Around 5:30. I watched through Murphy's front window as they led Coleman out of the administrative building in handcuffs. Linda Rodriguez was walking beside the FBI agents, carrying boxes of documents minus 3 years worth of environmental reports that Coleman had buried, water samples showing deliberate violations, emails between Coleman and his supervisors about optimizing compliance costs. The entire evening shift had gathered in the parking lot to watch. These were guys who'd worked double shifts to meet deadlines, who'd taken pride in building ships that defended America, who'd trusted their bosses to do the right thing. Seeing Coleman in cuffs wasn't justice minus, It was vindication for everyone who'd ever been told that safety concerns were obstacles to efficiency. Tommy Wells called me as the Federal van rove away. Wade, the whole crew wants to know minus you coming back. Depends on whether they want me back, I said. Father, we need you. Captain Hutchins is refusing to inspect any more work until you're back on the job. Says he won't trust anyone else's certification after what Coleman tried to pull. Helen arrived at Murphy's just as the sun was setting over the bay. She walked in looking like she'd just won a prize fight without throwing a punch. How bad is it for Coleman? I asked. Wire fraud, environmental crimes, interference with federal inspections, conspiracy to defraud the government. He's looking at 15 to 20 years minimum. His lawyer's already talking about plea deals. And the company, new management as of this afternoon. The board of directors held an emergency meeting. They want to offer you the position of chief engineer for all 3 destroyer contracts, plus oversight of environmental compliance. I thought about it while finishing my coffee. What about the crew? Full employment guarantees, pay raises across the board. And Wade minus they're promoting Tommy Wells to assistant chief engineer. Kid's got potential. We walked back to the shipyard together as the security lights were coming on. The place looked different somehow, minus cleaner, more honest. Captain Hutchins met us at the gate. Wade, good to see you again, he said, extending his hand. Ready to finish what we started? Ready as ever, Roy. Good. Because I just got word from Washington. Atlantic Shipbuilding is getting the next 5 destroyer contracts, not 3. Conditional on maintaining proper safety standards and environmental compliance. He looked around at the workers heading home after their shifts. And Wade, the Navy specifically requested you as chief engineer for the entire program. Your reputation matters more than you know. The next morning, I walked back into the engineering office for the first time in 18 hours. The coffee still tasted like motor oil, but somehow it tasted better than it had the day before. Tommy was already there, reviewing welding specifications with the kind of attention to detail that would serve him well as assistant chief engineer. Morning, boss, he said, grinning. Ready to build some ships? Been ready all my life, I said. We spent the next 6 months rebuilding not just the Hamilton but the entire culture of Atlantic shipbuilding. New environmental systems, upgraded safety protocols, proper training for everyone from apprentices to supervisors. The Hamilton passed her sea trials with flying colors minus, every system perfect. Every weld solid, every safety standard exceeded. Captain Hutchins sent me a bottle of Navy rum when she was commissioned, with a note. To the finest chief engineer in the fleet. Fair winds and following seas. I kept that bottle on my office shelf, next to the pictures of every ship I'd helped build over 37 years. It reminded me why we do this work minus, not for the money, not for recognition, but because somewhere out there, sailors are counting on us to build them ships that'll bring them home safe. Coleman got 18 years in federal prison. The company paid $75 million in EPA fines and cleanup costs, but kept all 800 jobs. Linda Rodriguez was promoted to Director of Environmental Compliance, and she made sure every drop of water leaving our facility was cleaner than when it came in. That's the thing about building ships minus. It's not just about steel and rivets and welding specifications. It's about integrity, about doing the job right even when nobody's watching, about understanding that cutting corners means putting lives at risk. We're the people who build the ships that defend America. And nobody minus, not some MBA with a fancy degree. Not some corporate executive worried about quarterly profits minus. Nobody was going to make us compromise on that. The Hamilton is still out there somewhere, keeping sailors safe in dangerous waters. That's worth everything we went through to build her right. After 4 decades in this business, I've learned that real strength isn't about overpowering people minus. It's about knowing when to walk away and let your work speak for itself. The best revenge against those who don't respect experience is simply being right when it matters most.